This video was only made possible through the very generous contributions of my patrons. Thank you. The central contribution of socionics to Jungian type theory, according to themselves and all who learn about it, is the theory of intertype relations, that is, a systematic approach to predicting how different types are most likely to interact with and respond to each other. And in all honesty, such a system is a very natural next step in type theory. Once one understands the structure that defines each type, then it would seem easy enough to talk about how those structures would theoretically mesh, or conflict with each other. Therefore, if socionics theory is taken as a natural outgrowth from the individual type models, then that means it carries the same limitations as those type models, namely that these are cognitive and not behavioral models. My take, anyway, on intertype relations is that they are simply the next theoretical step. If you buy into what each type and function theoretically means, then the predictions made by intertype relations, insofar as they are validly drawn, are a necessary conclusion. But it is imperative to remember that just as specific type descriptions should always be secondary to the theories from which they were drawn, so too must the specific descriptions of type relations be secondary to the theory. In a word, the what is subordinate to the why. For example, my relationship with Damon Gray of MBTV is described by socionics as one of supervision, me being an INFJ and him being an ENTJ, with him supervising me. But while this type of relation is stereotypically supposed to be negative, we are not constrained to have a stereotypical supervision relationship, any more than we are bound to be stereotypical ENTJs or INFJs. And many proponents of socionics will be sure to tell you this. Just as many proponents of MBTI will explain their own dislike of stereotypes, insofar as these stereotypes confuse or constrain people. My aim in this video is to get at the underlying theory and mainly the mechanics of the Socionics Intertype relations, the basic rules and laws that explain why, for instance, Damon and I are said to have a, quote, supervision relationship, and what that really means, not just on a surface description level, but on a deeper abstract level, where one can rely on oneself to distinguish the components of a type or of a type relation for oneself, despite the appearances and descriptions of things. The basic rule for understanding intertype relations is, where do my preferred functions appear in their stack? For instance, if I prefer an I as my dominant function, then my theoretical relation with an ESTP is, at bottom, a description of what happens when dominant Ni comes into contact with tertiary Ni, and by the same token, when their dominant Ti contacts my tertiary Ti. The relations are determined by the differing preferences of the same functions. This is because socionics regards the functions almost like specialized filters that process, metabolize, or otherwise handle different aspects of reality. For instance, if my TE function is, by preference, pushed down to the vulnerable function slot, the function slot that is described as vulnerable, then that means I am very sensitive about my grasp of TE and TE sorts of things. So when an ENTJ comes along, there's a lot of potential for that sensitive area to get irritated by them. And this would play a major role in our theoretical type relations, but more on that specifically later. Given that one already understands how the 8 cognitive functions work, the next important step is understanding how socionics describes the function stacks and the individual slots. And it is here that we reach a bit of a controversy, which I do not believe needs to be a controversy. That is, socionics, at least the most well-known version of it called Model A, works on an 8-function model, where every type is said to have all 8 functions. Now, I do not subscribe to an 8-function model per se, but in another way I basically do. For whether or not every type actually makes use of or is actually able to access the epistemic experience of what the 8 functions are like is not my concern right now. Rather, what's important is that every type have a certain describable attitude towards each function, whether or not they're actually experiencing it or not, or whatever that happens to mean, or the nature of each function that is determined by their preferences. Thus, if one prefers an I the most as a dominant function, then that would necessarily mean that they will not prefer, they will in fact in a certain way be repulsed by NE in a proportional way to how they are attracted to NI because of their theoretical relationship. This dynamic is represented in the following chart, where function preferences, quote, bleed over into the opposing attitude, almost like a shadow. Socionics stacks the 8 functions in the following way. The dominant and auxiliary functions are first and second, respectively. Their attitude opposites are 7th and 8th. The tertiary and inferior functions are 5th and 6th, and their attitude opposites are 3rd and 4th. And they are arranged like so. I will go over the individual function slots in a bit, but not quite yet. Thus, Socionics organizes each type into 4 blocks: the ego, the id, the superego, and the super-id. These divisions, in my estimation, and only my estimation, by the way, as far as I know, very roughly, but I think usefully, follow the same pattern as the 4-function model. Now, let me run over it, because I think it's a useful mnemonic tool to get a quick grasp on what these different blocks really mean. The ego block basically represents the dominant function because it is the most guiding part of the personality. The id block, which is the, quote, shadow of the ego functions, sort of represents the auxiliary function, though perhaps only in the sense of a type who is over-focused on their tertiary, so they're sort of ignoring their auxiliary entirely. For while the id block doesn't really cause that much trouble, and is actually relatively strong in a person, the person has nevertheless come to underappreciate it and not really like it that much. The super-id block, on the other hand, represents the tertiary function, especially in a type that tends to overappreciate their tertiary, insofar as both the tertiary and the inferior functions are there, and they tend to be a point of fascination for a type, and tend to respond well to stimulation from new information, instruction, etc. Finally, the superego block is like the inferior, because it represents the most vulnerable, sensitive, unconfident, and frustrated part of a person's personality, what they truly just do not get and do not like working with, yet somehow feel very deeply they ought to know how to do better. It's basically their recognized Achilles heel. The different intertype relations can now be organized and understood as different types' ego blocks naturally poking each other in the right or the wrong areas. For instance, the most potentially rewarding relationship, according to Socionics, is one of duality, where the types mutually stimulate each other's super-id blocks, which is precisely the block that wants more stimulation. On the other hand, in a, say, a conflict or in a supervision relationship, you have the tendency for the one's ego block to be stimulating the other's superego block, and that can obviously be irritating. So now let's get a little bit more in depth as we finish up this video. In order to better understand the blocks, let's look at the individual function slots and what they basically mean, as I understand it. In the ego block, you have slot number 1, and that's the leading or base function. It's the most comfortable, confident function in the stack. It's the leading function, the one that leads. Slot number 2 is what's called the creative function. It's used to solve problems or to interact with people. There's very much a sense that it is more of a tool in the person's function stack. Then you have slot 3. This is the superego. You have the role function, which is viewed as a personal weakness that one is struggling to improve. And then slot 4, which is the vulnerable function, and this just simply tends to cause extreme irritation. In the super-id, you have slot number 5, which has the suggestive, or sometimes called the dual-seeking function, which is entertaining, energizing, and fulfilling really in the greatest aspect, whereas slot number 6, which is the mobilizing and activating function, is very much appreciated, but more in like the proper doses. You can, in fact, get tired of this one. And finally, in the id block, we have slot number 7, which is the ignoring, or sometimes called the observing function. It comes when it's called, but it tends to be annoyed throughout its stay. That's another way of saying that they're good at using it, but they just don't really like to. And it's a similar story with slot number 8, which is the demonstrative function, which is, interestingly, so critical to the personality that its information is seen as utterly obvious, to the point that it's almost sort of frustrating when people keep on bringing it up. So that's what I have in this video. I do plan in the future to be talking more about the running through the actual mechanics of each of the socionics relations. I don't know when I'll be getting to that. I am also still going to finish up the type revisit videos, with the ESTP being next. I'm still doing work on that, but I just felt inspired, as it were, to go ahead and work with socionics a little bit. So I hope that you found this helpful. Please check the comments to make sure that people who are much better with socionics are, helping to critique or make sure that I've got my head on straight. And be absolutely sure to look up more information, because there's a lot to socionics, a lot of things that I might have, I know a lot of things that I did not cover, and possibly things I've misrepresented, so be sure to check that out. So anyway, have a very Merry Christmas, everybody, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.